Parallel walls, especially ones covered in reflective materials like tile or other hard surfaces, enhance echoes. So it's best if you're listening in an environment that doesn't have them. But of course, most rooms do have parallel walls, as well as a floor and ceiling that are parallel to each other. Sometimes it's best to handle reflections from these walls by breaking up the sound rather than trying to absorb all the echoes. Absorption alone can make the sound so dead that you overcompensate to give your mix extra ambience and a live quality that it may not need. So rather than deadening the room, it's a good idea to try diffusers. In the commercial space, studios will use professionally designed diffusers to break up the reflections. In a home studio environment, household items can perform the same functions. Bookcases, furniture of different shapes and sizes, and other everyday items will help break up the sound. Although this will not have a very scientific result, it will help redistribute the echoes so that they're less of a potential problem in your home recording space. Professional studios use well-calibrated diffusers of somewhat different designs, depending on the way they want the room to sound. It's important that absorption and diffusion materials are spaced evenly around the room to get the most consistent control over the echoes. That's the way to make your listening space sound as good as it can. Even with good absorbers in your control room, there's another problem that's not so easily treated. Bass sound waves don't respond as well to these kind of techniques. Bass waves are able to withstand absorbing and diffusion materials and can create low-frequency echoes in your room, as well as escape to the outside, potentially irritating neighbors or others in your living space. Professionals use various techniques to control bass echoes. Special materials called bass traps are often used in the corners of control rooms where bass can build up. Bass traps need to be thick if they're the larger, less expensive porous types, but they can be thinner, more effective, though more expensive, if they're the resonant type, which zeroes in on specific bass frequencies. To control bass sound waves seeping to the outside, studio designers use special techniques such as double-framed walls and floating floors, which allow space inside or underneath for the bass echoes to dissipate outside of the control room. Floating floors are particularly important in the live areas of the studio because the actions of the drummers and the vibrations of bass amps immediately interact with the floor, causing echoes that can be picked up by the microphones. In a home studio environment, special platforms can be bought or built that do a good job of insulating drum sets and bass amps from the main floor. Bass is one of the more difficult instruments to record cleanly and control acoustically. In fact, electric bass guitar is usually recorded through a direct box into the mixer or audio interface, which avoids the problem of controlling bass echoes when using microphones. But that can't happen when you're recording kick drum or acoustic bass, so it's a good idea to treat the acoustics of your room carefully if you'll be recording and monitoring a lot of live, bass-heavy music. So how can you tell if your room needs to be acoustically treated to be a good listening environment for a recording studio? The first thing is to walk all around the space you're going to use and make your own quick test. Later, you can have the room professionally analyzed or do it yourself with test equipment. But initially, you can simply walk around the room clapping your hands once at various locations and listening closely for the echoes. Determine where you'll be sitting when you're recording and mixing, and think about how the monitors will sound there. You'll quickly get an idea of what kind of treatment the room needs. One thing you can do in smaller spaces is to avoid setting up your speakers flush against one wall. Instead, set them up rather in a corner so that you reduce or eliminate the problem of parallel walls from the beginning. There should always be a degree of space between the backs of your monitors and the closest walls. This helps eliminate initial reflections that could color the sound immediately. And of course, you should maintain the optimum mix position, which forms an equilateral triangle between your two speakers and your ears. If you want to do more precise testing of your control room, you can do it with a microphone and a frequency spectrum analyzer. This is a device that graphs the frequency response of your room as you play back audio through your monitors and record the sound with a microphone. Several plugins and applications are available which can do this job for you with the help of the right microphone. It's a great method for discovering major problems in your recording space. Often you can correct these problems by moving your mix position or by adding or rearranging acoustic treatment materials, including the absorbers and diffusers you already have. If you have enough space to create a live room that's separate from your control room, you want to treat it acoustically as well. The acoustics of your live room can be even more critical because the natural ambience of the space can be a big plus or a big problem when you're recording live instruments like drums, percussion, acoustic guitars, and other mic'd instruments. If your recording environment is particularly reverberant, perhaps it's your basement or a spare bedroom, you might want to build yourself some absorbent panels like this one. It's a very simple kind of a picture frame design, some plywood in the back with some smaller pieces of wood around, and then inside, behind this fabric, is insulation, yellow insulation that absorbs the sound. You just cover it with very inexpensive fabric and put them around to break up your hard surfaces. So as I said before, each surface has a hard component and a soft component. And if you'll notice, these are tipping out from the wall. They're on these little hooks, and they can be removed and tipped around various ways. But the top is tipping out from the wall, so it's not parallel to the other wall. It tips in, both sides tip in like that, so the waves don't bounce directly back and forth. They bounce in a different angle and dissipate. If the room naturally has a lot of reflections when untreated, you want to experiment with controlling these echoes without making the room too dead with too many absorbers and diffusers. Remember to space them evenly around the room and to test the acoustics frequently by recording live instruments and listening to the room sound before that gets recorded, before finalizing any wall or ceiling treatments. One of the most common recording aids is the movable baffle, a panel covered in absorbent material that can surround a player or isolate his instrument so that the sound doesn't bleed into the microphones of other instruments. This isn't a problem if the player or a singer is recording by themselves or has their own space. Large studios have isolation or ISO booths, where a singer or player can perform at their desired volume without bleeding into the other microphones when playing with a group. Large movable panels are known as gobos, and if you have carpentry skills, you can make them without spending a lot of money. But newer designs have resulted in less expensive isolation tools, such as the mic reflection filter I demonstrate in a separate video. How much time you spend on acoustics depends on what kind of music you're making or what kind of sound you need to capture. If you only make instrumental electronic dance music, you might only need to be sure the room you're working in doesn't have any big problems like bass buildup or excessive reflections. You might even get by with a good pair of mixing headphones to monitor with. But for most kinds of music, you'll need to think about the sound of the room as well as the sound you're recording.